Thanks, Katie. Okay, awesome. All right. So first, I looked at just to get started, I was reflecting before I did this talk, and I've probably done like, I don't know, hundreds of talks by now, and just noticing, uh, I don't know if it's the audience list or if I don't know if it's a topic, but it's something that I just sort of, I deeply, deeply care about. And this is going to be a little bit of a choose your own adventure. You're going to have a private adventure today where I'm going to show some cool examples and you can do kind of your own internal process with. So hopefully it'll be fun. All right. I want to just start by saying why this talk. So, this was sort of, I could pick to do a talk on anything. And this was of any talk, free talk that we do for the community here at Continuum. This is what I picked. And I really came from a place where I was noticing myself and others around being more and more impacted by this reality polarization. And it's sort of like coming into our homes and our dinner tables and around our holidays, where these big, intense emotions and these adamant opinions, and sometimes where we're so kind of activated that there's very little interest in dialogue or feedback. And recognizing that sometimes I'm that person who's insisting on my perspective, and other times when I'm the recipient of that. And just noticing how much suffering and disconnection can follow from these types of encounters where we're not able to productively dialogue. And so this talk today is not wading into that. It's actually an exercise around, can we zoom out? And on a personal level, well, I guess this is still professional, but as doing ethicist work and as a trauma psychologist, animals have just been one of my favorite refuges, like learning about them, understanding them, and really kind of helping me zoom out. All right, so some quick considerations though for the talk today. Again, like I mentioned, there will be a recording, so if you missed it, we can go ahead and I'll post that, and then the slides are going to be posted. So what I'll do today, just so you get a sense of the flow, and all of you brave humans just sort of signed up not knowing what actually you're getting into, working with someone who loves experiential activities. It will be private, so you're not going to have to pour your heart out to anyone else. But I'll talk about a cool animal example that represents a unique way of experiencing reality. And then I'm going to introduce some contemplative questions that you'll sort of take little bites of and notice your internal response and reflect on your own perceptions. And part of the spirit of what I'm doing, it's not about finding the answer to these questions. It's more about the process of opening up and getting curious. And this comes from Radically Open DBT, which we'll talk a little bit more about what that is. But the spirit of it is coming from a place of humility and gentleness towards our quirks. In ACT, they talk about whole, complete, perfect. So this sort of gentleness towards, oh, this is how my programming is. And what do I want to do with that? Okay, second point I wanted to make here is that, there's a spectrum of anthropomorphizing animals. I'll probably slip and do that once or a few times today. But how can we not to some degree? Because we are limited by our own senses in trying to understand other species' experiences. Dr. Molly Womack helps me a lot with this talk, and she, well, if it's good, it's credit to her. If I mess something up, then it's not her fault. But she's going to be at Cornell University, so she's a wildlife biologist, sensory ecologist, and kind of fact checking some of this. And I do want to briefly address this idea of animal research. And I thought she made an important point that's pretty consistent with some of the themes we're going to be talking about. So historically, she said, old school, they used to tell anyone who did animal research, don't you name your animals. So don't develop that attachment such that when you have to euthanize them, it hurts. And the new culture around that is evolving. And she sort of mentioned it's now, you do name your animal. And you know what it means when you euthanize them, right? So this more kind of forming attachments and letting go. Right? I also want to, Curtis Anderson, he did some of the wildlife photography that's really cool in this talk. And then also just a shout out to the RO DBT and ACT community who have taught me basically a lot of the things you're going to learn about today. All right. So one of the points that I want to make around our perceptions and constructed realities, just to lay the groundwork, comes from this famous quote, and it's been attributed to so many people. But this idea that we see things as we are, not necessarily as they are. So what we mean by that is like, we only see so much of the world and the universe that we have the apperceptive organs to be able to detect. And even within humans, we vary. So for some humans, red and green are actually the same color. For some people with synesthesias, you taste sound or you see smells. But I want to make the point also that we're actually not even consistent within ourselves, much less from one person to the other. So let's look at an example of this. All right, so I'm about to show you this little short action. I want you to look at A and B. And for A and B, I want you just to notice if the colors are the same for you. Is A and B the same color? And we're going to look at a progression. Okay. All right. And then I want A and B are the same, and I'm going to pause it here. Are they still the same? Are they still the same? Now, many of us will look at A and B, and our mind is no longer telling us those are the same shade. So what's happening here? Our programming detects that there's a shadow, and that shadow tends to darken the color, and it's automatically adjusting for us, right? Kind of a cool little illusion to illustrate this. So along these lines, one of the points I want to make is that color is not actually a fixed property of light or even of the object. It's a sensation in our brain. So if we look at this really, what I would call a beautiful sunset, our brain is generating that. And if we think about rainbows, there's an infinite number of frequencies there, but our mind has learned to categorize them into colors. Now, how many colors is actually a topic of debate because some cultures will divide into more or less cultures, right? And so one of the metaphors I want to bring up is that we're really viewing life by looking at a dashboard and not through the windshield, even though sensory-wise, it feels like we're looking through the windshield. And so our brain is continuously selectively filtering and creating gauges of what's most salient for us. So billions of bytes of information, and it's filtering it down. So we know what to respond to and attend to. And we're not directly sensing the world, but these processed signals from the world. It's almost like knowing how much gas is in your car, never by looking at the gas tank, but always by looking at the gauge. Now, the problem is if you don't realize you're looking at a gauge and not the actual gas tank, right? That can lead to some distortions when we hold our reality as the reality. Another example of that, scientist and philosopher Andy Clark calls our consciousness this personalized, controlled hallucination. And that's okay. Hopefully, we all have more adaptive, more workable hallucinations. Another illustration of this is sort of perceptually, we're about 100 milliseconds behind what's actually happening because of the time it takes to be processed. So if we are trying to catch a ball or someone's punching us, we need to be able to project trajectories, because if there's a delay, we're not going to be able to protect ourselves. And so our mind also has that correction capacity. Right? We're not getting the real-time feed. We're getting a guess about the real-time feed. And we see this kind of in day-to-day examples, right? When people are too caught up in their mental models. You know, sometimes you might feel like you're around people, you just sort of push play and they tell the same stories and they respond the same ways. And we call that kind of rule-based insensitivity, where they've created rules and they're no longer cueing into their environment. There's an animal example. I decided not to show the video in here because it's a little bit sad, but a bird is trying to nurture her eggs and they got squished, totally squished. Like these eggs are not making it. But this bird isn't cueing into that new data and continues to have that internal drive, right, to try to keep these eggs warm. Now, I'm going to imagine for us that most of the time, the underdeveloped muscle is going to be bringing our attention to our immediate awareness as opposed to getting caught up in our minds, right? I think it's always fun when if you go travel to a new culture and you try to get a cup of coffee there, how it really can turn off all of that automation because you're kind of like, where do I stand? What do I do? Or maybe it doesn't, right? And that's where you get some of the ugly American stories where they come in for their Starbucks and they want it their way according to their expectations. I see this also sometimes with people who have high social anxiety. And it's really that process sort of like leaning forward and saying, hey, can you actually look at my face right now and see what my face is saying to you, not your fears about what might be happening. So another cool animal example I'll bring up and then we'll jump into it. Uh, when it comes to our own kind of programming, I'll bring up crickets. So one question that scientists had was, how does a cricket chirp so loud but not deafen itself to be able to hear around it, right? And it turns out crickets can selectively filter the sound so they don't actually hear themselves, right? Interesting idea to be able, wouldn't it be interesting to just be able to talk and then you've decided, I don't need to even hear the sound of my voice. I can just be listening to others. Frogs can do something similar, which accounts, that technology was related to noise cancellation, where they, with their lungs, they can filter out the sounds to be able to detect the croaks they want to. So. All right. So the first little tool that I want to introduce today, and some of you know this who are in the RO world, but let me say what RO is. So Radically Open DBT is an evidence-based treatment for disorders of overcontrol. So that's sort of an umbrella of conditions where the overdeveloped muscle is perfectionism, rigidity, control of the environment, planning, organizing, strategizing, as opposed to letting go and flexing. And RO has its roots in some Sufi principles. So think Rumi, like the poetry from Rumi. So we'll try some of these out privately today, but let me kind of orient to what the steps are. I'll ask questions and you just sort of notice if there's an edge, and that's defined as some kind of an unpleasant internal experience that you might typically avoid. And instead of avoiding it, you're going to kind of turn towards it with some curiosity and awareness to say, what can I learn? Trying to fix it or figure it out. And then open up to the multitude of thoughts, feelings, and action urges that come along with it to sort of watch it. And then see if you can find a worthwhile question to keep asking yourself that helps you kind of stay in the curious place. So again, this idea of self-inquiry that's used a lot in RO DBT and in some other traditions as well. It's about getting good at asking questions and not at solving problems. Not forcing clarity, even if it feels comforting. And that really comes from this philosophy that life is inherently uncertain. And if we can't tolerate ambiguity, then we're going to really struggle to tolerate life. And radically moving towards this idea of having a philosophy of living where you ask more questions than get answers. I mean, and answers can be important sometimes, but being able to be comfortable in the unknown is such a beautiful gift for us. We can cultivate it. Okay, so let's jump into one of the first examples. And I'm going to start around with this idea of getting curious about our judgments, around how we personally decide what's ethical, what's okay, kind of passable, and what's just wrong. Where we know with just that absolute moral certitude, that is not okay. And, when you look historically at the human fossil record, it's estimated that about 15 to 30% of children died from homicide in the Mesolithic period. So you go about 8,000 years, well, probably 10,000 years ago now. Things were quite different. So we can ask ourselves, like, when and where did blame enter? Do we blame them? Do we think they're wrong? Do we ascribe it to the context? Similarly, we take it to animals, and bears and felines and rats and prairie dogs and insects and fish all have been observed eating their young, right? Moms eating their young. What's the pivot our mind does that allows us to be understanding of that as a part of nature? Like, if you have pets, does your cat or dog have a moral obligation to you? Like when you say bad dog, do you mean it? Do you think your vet dog is bad? All just sort of interesting things. The answer is less important than the curiosity. And so to look at this example of all these cool pictures, take a minute and reflect. Who is part of your tribe here? How connected do you feel to these different species? And who do you care less about? Who would you protect if they needed help? Who would you feed? And who would you be willing to kill? We look in the top left, and Dr. Womack was talking about how we differentiate this. Many people, if the creature has eyes, it makes a difference. Another factor is, does it matter to you that this bacteria's lifespan is only 12 minutes? Do you feel much more willing to pour some bleach on him? Or him, her, it, that, So it gets at these in-group, out-group ideas, right? And for me, I feel much more comfortable killing bacteria. And I was having this discussion with Molly around that. I said, well, yeah, but it's my moral justification. We're so much more complicated. We have these big internal states and meaning. And she said, whoa. To be clear, bacteria actually do have complex internal states. You may devalue them more, but there's a lot going on. Just kind of interesting. And they're finding that more and more in animal research and sensory ecology, that myths around our superiority and intelligence are beginning to crumble a little bit more when we understand the animal through their own context. Okay. So again, it gets at this idea of moral humility and self-inquiry. Getting curious about our certitude when we get in these fixed mindsets, or moral despair when it feels hopeless. And sometimes those are connected. We get so locked into trying to force something, and when it fails, then we go into despair. I really like this quote. The problems that remain persistently unsolvable should be suspected as questions asked in the wrong ways. Okay, we'll start with our first self-inquiry practice. And again, these are just questions that I'm going to lob up, and you notice what shows up for you. And see if you can call to mind an example where either you harshly judged yourself or another person. And it doesn't have to be externally. It could be a private, secret judgment you had. I'll give you a second to think of that. Okay. So let's see if we can ask ourselves, where did I get the idea that blame was needed? What could happen if I let go of that? Is it possible that I'm feeling threatened here? And if so, what am I fearing? Do I ever secretly hope that harshly blaming will protect or prepare me for the future, make me better? When have I or someone I cared about done the exact same thing? And how did I explain it at that time? And the last one here, what harsh judgments have I made that contradict each other? And as we do this, see if you notice there's a lot of questions here, and the pacing is quite fast where you can't really digest it fully. And just notice what that's like for you. Right? Asking the question, but not getting a clear answer. Okay, we're going to switch to a new example. So this is a cuttlefish, and we're going to talk about this idea of the trade-offs of discipline and self-control. And to start off, some of you who are in the psych world understand or know a little bit about the marshmallow test, but quick recap, basically it was this classic psychology experiment done with toddlers that looked at inhibitory control. So could a toddler, given the chance to either sit at a table with with a marshmallow in front of them, they could wait and be awarded 2 marshmallows, or if they couldn't inhibit it and they ate the first marshmallow, they wouldn't get the second one, right? So it's about delayed gratification. And there was all of this extrapolation that the kiddos that could do this delayed gratification had better graduation rates, less substance abuse, less criminal activity. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. But first, let's look at this video. So this is a video where they attempted to replicate that same self-control experiment with a cuttlefish. And you're not going to see the beginning part where they train the cuttlefish. It got the choice between the live prey and a frozen gross shrimp. And the cuttlefish was trained, if you eat the shrimp, we pull the live prey out. And so once it understood that contingency, then it got to choose. Do you wait for the better one, or do you take the good one right away? And let's see what happens. This is by Dr. Schnell, by the way, out of Cambridge University.
Phase of the experiment, where we test for self-control in the cuttlefish. We insert both chambers into the cuttlefish tank, one marked with a circle and one marked with a triangle.
Remember, the circle's associated with food that's accessible immediately, while the triangle signifies food that the cuttlefish needs to wait for.
In the chamber with the circle, we drop non-live prey, which is less preferable, and then in the chamber with the triangle, we drop live prey, which is more preferable. The cuttlefish is now faced with a difficult decision. It can access the less preferable non-live prey in the circle chamber immediately, or it can wait for the door to open in the delay chamber so it can access the preferable prey.
Even as the door to the shrimp opens, the cuttlefish waits. It seems to have learned that if it goes for the non-live shrimp, then its preferred food, the live crawfish, will be removed.
This is a challenging decision, so the cuttlefish tries to distract itself by looking away from the prey that's immediately available.
Which is reminiscent of some of the children's behavior in the marshmallow experiment.
After a minute, the door finally opens to the delayed chamber, and the cuttlefish that's been waiting very patiently can finally access its reward inside. This is the first time that we've seen advanced self-control in an invertebrate species, in a species that isn't long-lived and isn't social. It's really...
Okay, so few thoughts there. One, she said the cuttlefish is trying to distract itself. That's a bit of it's a hypothesis, right? We don't really actually know what the cuttlefish might have been doing. But the last point that she also made at the end that I thought was interesting was that inhibitory control among humans is theorized to be pro-social. If we just snatch it right away, we're not sharing well. But cuttlefish, they're solitary. So why might they be doing that? And in case you're curious, her hypothesis is that cuttlefish might be in places in the ocean where they see food that they want to eat, but there are predators around and they're kind of defenseless. So being able to have inhibitory control under certain conditions. So let's talk about applying to the human. This is a study done about almost 15 years ago that basically did the marshmallow test globally. And one of the things that they found when you look at this, and they ranked who displayed the most inhibitory control, which countries and which least. And one of the things they found is that in Sweden, they had the highest levels on average. And in Rwanda, they had the lowest levels. And I want you just to notice if any kind of judgments or thoughts show up about that in any direction. One of the things they discovered, though, is that this is highly correlated, the amount of inhibitory control, with how stable the economy is. So in places with lower crime rates, delayed gratification is a more viable strategy, where there's less corruption. However, in other countries, it's actually disincentivizing to save resources because there might be a moral obligation to share it with those family members who need it, or it could be taken from you. Right? Okay. So let's move on to a new topic. This is the idea of letting go of control and the fun and art of non-productivity. And this gets emphasized in RO DBT around this idea that many species engage in play. And what's interesting when they've studied it is the absence of play is not boredom, it's depression. Like when you block rat pups from being able to play, they get quite depressed. And let's look at this. Let's look at your relationship with fun and ease. Right? So ask yourself, have I ever been given feedback? that I work too hard or need to relax? Do I find it hard to self-soothe or experience pleasure without feeling guilt? To what extent do I believe that relaxing, playing, or recreation has to be earned? Does anyone actually enjoy the game of Monopoly? That's just that I just am actually curious. That has nothing to do with this presentation. It's just a poll I'm taking. Ha ha. Um, and then lastly, this is a serious question. What do I find amusing? Really amusing. Now, one of the reasons I put dumb questions or jokes, bad jokes about Monopoly in here is just also the spirit that we can get locked into figuring things out. And it really doesn't matter as much as it feels sometimes. This picture here, mollusks have gotten really kind of underappreciated historically. This is an octopus who was given a pill bottle that can float and has learned to play catch with itself. So it'll throw the floating pill bottle into the water current with one arm and then catch it with the other arm and throw it. Right. Kind of cool. All right. So let's talk a little bit about another core RO theme, which is approaching ambiguity with more openness and curiosity. So we're going to talk about like what causes us to close down and go into threat mode, and when is it needed and not needed. By the way, looking at this mantis, anybody have their mind looking at their face say, oh, he's smiling? That's what my mind comes up with. All right. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit around this idea of approaching ambiguity with these animal boldness tests. And this is commonly done in wildlife biology, where they're sort of looking at variations within species in terms of boldness. And if you have a pet, you know this, right? Just like humans, there is a range in personality. And it gets at this threat sensitivity, reward sensitivity ratio. So if you look on the right here, this is a group of baboons. And they've been given a new kind of stimulus that they've not encountered. It's a bowl of cereal. And I want you just to observe the amount of energy and work of experiencing this novel thing in their environment. Right? Let's take a look. You notice the second one's out of there. He leaves. Okay. So you can be aware of that's a lot of work. That's a lot of extra cognitive energy, right? To be able to really incorporate new information. And ambiguity is taxing. And there is some research that says we prefer knowing a negative outcome with certitude than just sitting in the unknown. And that can create problems for us, right? There's this false sense of knowing when we often don't. And how do we start to relax a little bit more around not knowing? So let's do a little questioning around this theme. And just noticing what reaction shows up, not finding the answer. How's my relationship with uncertainty these days? How was it as a kiddo? What can remain a mystery to me these days? And where do I attempt to force clarity? All right. It's kind of a quick pace, but again, you'll have the slides. So if you want to come back to these questions and kind of really mull on them a little bit longer, you'll have them. Okay, so this next theme looks at awareness. And what you're seeing here is a photograph taken by a wildlife photographer of a mother attempting to protect her foal from a cheetah attack. Cheetah's trying to get food. Mom's trying to protect her foal. And what was striking about this was the wildlife photographer spent some time talking about the experience of taking this photograph. And one of the things that he said was, I will remember this experience for the rest of my life. It has left an imprint, and it's something that I'll never forget. Now, what's striking about this is that what we can hypothesize about the zebra, the mother, is that she may likely have a very different experience than the wildlife photographer. We can't know for sure. But what we understand about zebras is that many zebras spend more time sensing the present than having a capacity to rerun the past or run scary scenarios in the future. Some of you may have heard from the book in the 90s called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. Sort of this idea, he's a neurologist and biologist that looks at how zebras have acute stress instead of chronic. They don't sit and mull, kind of like this wildlife photographer was. And it gets at one of those classic quotes from William James, right? My experience is what I attend to. Only the things I notice will shape my mind. It's pretty cool. This next slide, we're not going to go through for time's sake, but it's the self-inquiry related to the zebra, if you want to do that. Okay. So we're also going to talk about this theme of connection, which is profoundly important in RO DBT. And I like this quote from Francis Weller: life is a solitary journey, you can't do it alone. And what you're seeing behind it is a rendering of an elephant-nosed fish. And one really, I think, incredible thing that biologists noticed is that these fish would spread out in a precise configuration in the water and then just sit there. And the biologists were trying to figure out, what are they doing? How is that adaptive? Like, right? And what they discovered is that these fish are creating an electric network that is larger than the electric field that any fish can generate on their own. And then they're able to share signals with each other to get instantaneous data about the environment. So if you can imagine, it's almost like you're walking in a crowd. And if you could see through everyone's eyes at the same time to get data from all the perspectives of what's around you. Pretty incredible, right? That seamless form of connection. You know, and connection historically has been about survival, right? Life and death. And when we think about connection and Tribe for Humans, it's, you know, there's this great quote that I like by Lisa Feldman Barrett, she's a professor, that says, you know, the best thing for our nervous system can be another human. The worst thing for our nervous system can be another human, right? Just gets at how deeply we are wired to be attending to threat and social inclusion and exclusion. And some of us who are OC try really hard to hack that and control that and manage perceptions and be people pleasing, right? And OC, by that term, I mean over control. People who tend to, when in doubt, let's just try to control that. Let's just try to make it the way I want it. But what we also might need to remember is that other people's opinions of us is just electrical activity in our brain, right? So let's look at some questions here. Do we really want others to alert us to our potential blind spots about ourselves? What do I consider to be invalidating? If I'm ruminating after a social interaction, what might that tell me? What was I hoping for? What am I worried about? Who do I think I really need to belong? And this last one, am I more likely to expect myself or others to have to change? All right, let's talk about bees. So this is a cool example that's come out recently. So since the 1940s, biologists have been aware of this idea that bees do a waggle dance, right? And some of you know this, right? That their waggle dance actually shares very important information to some of the other bees, right? It can share information about the distance, the quality, and the direction of a nectar source. But one fascinating phenomenon that they discovered is that even though the bees doing their waggle dance, some bees are just not listening. They found estimates about 1 out of 5 are just not even paying attention to get the data to then fly to the nectar source more efficiently. Right? But an interesting newer study looked at this and found that under certain adverse conditions where the hive is being challenged environmentally, that those bees that are not following the protocol, right, actually increased foraging success. So these bees that seem to not follow the rules under certain conditions really came in and saved the hive, right? Sort of that valuing diversity in responses and not always the efficient way of being. Right? Creativity, exploration. I'm going to go fly over here and look over here. Pretty cool. Okay. To switch gears a little bit, we'll go through maybe 2 more examples and then I'll open up for questions. So one thing that's really important, oh, by the way, if you're curious what these are, this is an ermine and a stoat. Really cool. Just beautiful animals. Though on the left, that's actually a dance. We call it a dance, but intended to confuse prey, sort of with these movements, part of the hunting. So, I'm coming up on about 20 years of doing therapy, somewhere between 15 and 20. And I think one of the things that is becoming most important in what I'm doing in the room with other people is almost helping them relearn how to learn. Right? So there's this idea that many of us were raised in environments where there was a lot of pressure on our learning, or that we had to get it right away, or mistakes were heavily punished, or better to not try at all than embarrass yourself, right? Social propriety. And that can really limit us. So relearning that self-compassion, how to be humble and open and collaborate with others as we learn. And it really helps to have this thing called healthy self-doubt. This is a concept from RO DBT as well. And what that's defined as is basically being able to consider that we might be wrong or incorrect without either falling apart. Oh my gosh, I'm bad. I'm horrible. It's humiliating. Or harshly blaming someone else. Well, it's because of how you threw the ball. Right? Healthy self-doubt also that we're trying to cultivate, it doesn't take ourselves too seriously. We kind of laugh at ourselves. And this is hard when we're in threat mode. So this takes some active practice, right, of being kind of silly, easygoing, playful. And that our quirks are kind of cool, that we can have a sense of kindness towards them, and that we'll learn faster and grow more flexible with that gentle approach. So you might ask yourself if you err more on closed-mindedness, like, I know I'm right, or more on the excessive self-doubt. I know I'm wrong. Right? Okay, so I'm going to show a video here, and this gets at this idea of the learner's mindset. This is a giraffe that has just been born, and it's pretty important that they're able to stand quickly because of predators. And I want you just to notice what arises as you watch the video. You maybe reflect, we actually did this, right? Each of us to learn to walk, we did a lot of these things. And what are you still willing to flail around with in public with other people watching? And if we were free from that self-consciousness, what might that offer you? get a little encouragement from mom, but you notice otherwise she's sort of standing and letting the baby flail. And at the end, kind of the group coming back together. Okay. You know, I think about, I work with a lot of just highly capable, high achieving people. And in a way, it's such a beautiful thing. The other side of that, though, is how much of our self-worth are we sourcing from our competence and being skilled at things? And what happens when we retire and it's this new period of learning, right? And we're actually quite bad at things. How might we see ourselves, right? So one of the ideas might be celebrating earnestness and amateurism, right? Instead of this like slick style of I got it all figured out. Kind of like in the movies. You know, you always see those scenes where people, they walk into the office place and it's like, hey, grab the paper, got it, got the quick joke, right? Just, or the podcast where I think everybody's so eloquent and I just learned that the amount of editing that goes into them. Yeah. Okay, let's look. Well, not that again. Okay. So ask yourself, what's something new you'd like to try? Anything. Could be a sport, could be cooking, it could be resting, it could be stand-up comedy. Who knows? Gardening. And see what your predictions are if you tried it. How good do you expect yourself to be, especially if others are watching? And what would I need to actually be able to laugh at myself when I make mistakes? I'm just aware of the thought, it'd be so nice to have us humans in person. I'm finding myself being so curious what responses we have and wishing we could sort of share those, but alas. Okay. All right. I'll go through three more slides, and then we'll either wrap up early or I'll ask a few questions or answer a few questions. I've asked enough questions. Haha. Okay, so this is another RO skill, and this is called the awareness continuum. And there's different facets to why this is taught for over control and that chronic stress. But the one I want to highlight today is just the flow of you just being spontaneous and noticing what arises without needing to curate it or manage it. So I'm going to play a sonogram of a few different animal heartbeats. And I want you just to kind of turn the spotlight of your attention into noticing the few initial things that your body generates from it. And there's not a right or wrong thing. It does what it does, right? There's nothing at stake here, literally. All right, and then I'll tell you what the animals are after. So let's get going. Let me turn this up. That's the first one. Okay, so those were the three, and I'll go through what they were, but just reflecting kind of what that evoked in you, right? Any thoughts, whatever urges or feelings? Did you mute it? If I had you all here, I'd see if we could play a guessing game, but I think I'll just tell you the answer. So the first one was a cheetah. Hear that again. I guess you didn't need to hear it. There we go. Second one was a blue whale. That really slow 6 heartbeats a minute. That one creeped me out. And then the third one, a hummingbird, right? Hundreds of beats a minute. Okay, so I want to end just with this quote, and this is from Ed Young. we creatures share the same physical space, but experience it in wildly different ways. And the same is true for billions of other animal species on the planet, and then countless individuals within those species. Earth teems with sights and textures and sounds and vibrations and smells and tastes, electro and magnetic fields. But every animal can only tap into a small fraction of reality's fullness. Each is enclosed with its own sensory bubble, perceiving but a tiny sliver of an immense world. Right? So again, looping it back to that early theme of when we feel like we know, right? We see the picture or someone else thinks they know, just understanding what our senses give us and what they don't, right? Lastly, I want to just mention some cool resources and recommendations. By the way, this is not an animal. This is a plant that grows on the seafloor of Japan, I think. Pretty cool looking though. I love discussing these ideas. I mean, this was mostly a passion project for me. So my email is there. If this is of interest of you and you want to have more dialogues or you have comments, I'm open to the feedback. Feel free to email me. Also on that website, greenwellpsychology.com is my newsletter. I would say I'd probably do a public talk maybe quarterly if you want to be alerted to future ones I'm doing. Some of this was drawn by An Immense World. That's a Pulitzer Prize winning author who writes a lot about this theme. Not so much RO DBT, but truly more on the animal side of how they sense their environments. The Light Eaters is a book. It's almost a similar theme book, but just for plants. So if you love plants, that's being published next week and has gotten great reviews. Here's some other things that just inspire me. I mean, I imagine many people here know Mary Oliver, right? Yeah, Wild Geese. Great poetry for nature. Wildlife photography. That's one of my favorite burnout things, right? Of just looking at the awards. Sort of zooms me out, or going to the Natural History Museum when I feel like, oh my God, I humiliated myself. It's like, oh, you're just a speck. You are a speck in billions of years, right? Some cool podcasts that really get at some of these themes. And then RO DBT, again, the kind of public edition of their book is coming out very soon, I've heard. But right now, what they have is sort of a therapist manual and a skills book. I teach classes on this RO DBT theme every week. And so I would say you probably, if you're not a therapist, you probably want to wait for the book to come out, but some really cool ideas if you were interested in what I shared today. And then of course, ACT. Robin Walser's been a long-term supervisor of mine, and they've all written, these three folks and others have all written some pretty cool books. All right, and so with that, it looks like I love ending a little bit early, but let me pause, stop this, and see if there's any questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay. Oh, I see faces of people I really adore. Did I do it all? You're like, enough questions?
I want to make sure everyone's able to unmute if they want to ask a question, because we did mute all at the beginning. So if you're having an issue, just raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
Yeah.
But hopefully you'll be able to do it on your end as well.
Ashley, do you have a favorite moment in nature or interaction with the wild that evokes this sense of awareness and smallness? And
Oh. Oh my gosh, what a great question. I wish something readily came to mind. I'm gonna be honest, I don't, but David, do you?
my dog just died December 31st, my big Great Pyrenees that I got from a shelter. He was a working dog. His name's Bugaboo.
Mhm.
And so I held him in my lap. I still feel it right now, like on a couch in a veterinarian's office, and experienced his last breath with him, and it was heartbreaking and tender and made me love that dog even deeper. And then also just know that I'm going to die one day. And yeah, it was tender.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean talk about Rumi, that is the ocean in a drop. Like that momentary experience is everything, right? Yeah. All right, well, I think unless people jump in with more questions, I'll put the video up if you think anyone else might be wanting to see this. The slides are up. And then thank you all. It's really just cool to know that other people are interested in this as well. So take care, all of you, and you have your 10 minutes back.